In 1968, in a jungle camp in the Central Highlands, a North Vietnamese political officer named Locke faced a problem he had not been trained to solve. One of his soldiers had come back from captivity with a story, and the story was wrong. The soldier had been wounded and captured in a firefight weeks earlier, and everyone had assumed he was dead because everyone knew what the Americans did to prisoners. Locke had told them himself many times. The Americans were brutal. They tortured the men they captured. They executed the wounded. This belief was not idle to Locke. It kept men fighting to the death rather than surrendering. And a man who will not surrender is a hard man to beat. The belief was, in its way, a weapon. And now, here was this soldier, back from the dead, telling the other men what had actually happened to him. He said that when he was hit, an American, one of the men who had just been trying to kill him, had crawled to him under fire, stopped his bleeding, and carried him out. He said he had been flown to a hospital on the same helicopter as wounded Americans. He said American doctors had saved his leg. He said that in all his time as a prisoner, no one had tortured him at all. The other soldiers were listening. That was the problem. Locke could see it on their faces, the confusion, the crack opening in something that was supposed to be solid. An army runs on belief, and Locke could feel a belief starting to come apart in front of him, and he had to close it fast before it spread. So Locke did the only thing he could do. He told them it was a trick. He looked his soldiers in the eye and explained that the American kindness was a deception designed to make them doubt, to soften them, to make them hesitate the next time they should fight. The medic who saved their comrade was not being kind. He was being cunning. It was all part of the enemy's plan, and some of the men believed him because they wanted to, but not all of them. And the ones who did not would carry a question for the rest of the war that Locke could never answer. They had been taught to hate a monster, and one of them had been carried out of the fire gently by the monster's own hands. That is the story of a lie that ran into the truth. Now let me show you why the lie was necessary and why it could not hold. If a story like this matters to you, if the men who lived it on both sides deserve to be remembered, a like and a subscribe help it reach the people who care. It takes 1 second. These are the stories the history books leave out. Now, to understand why an officer would tell his men that mercy was a trick, you first have to understand why he needed them to believe it. And then you have to understand the thing that kept getting in the way. To understand why Locke told his men that American kindness was a deception, you have to start somewhere uncomfortable with the fact that, from his position, it was a reasonable thing to do. Not honest, but reasonable. And understanding why is the key to this whole story. Every army that has ever fought has understood that war is not only a physical contest, it is also a contest of belief. What a soldier believes about his enemy shapes how he fights, and armies have always worked to shape those beliefs deliberately. This is not unique to one side. Every army in that war and in every war told its soldiers stories about the enemy designed to make them fight harder. The question is never whether an army does this. The question is only which stories it tells and why. The North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong had a particular need for their soldiers to believe particular things because of the kind of war they were fighting. They were the weaker side in raw material terms. They could not match American firepower or mobility or supply. What they had instead was the willingness of their soldiers to endure and sacrifice at a level that astonished their enemies, to keep fighting under conditions and against odds that would have broken most armies. That willingness was their true weapon, and it had to be maintained. And belief was how you maintained it. And one of the most important beliefs for a soldier's willingness to fight is what he thinks will happen to him if he is captured. Consider the two possibilities. If a soldier believes that surrender means humane treatment, medical care, safety, eventual return home, then surrender becomes a rational option when a fight turns hopeless. Why die when you can live? But if a soldier believes that capture means torture and death, then surrender is no better than dying in the fight and might be worse, and so he keeps fighting to the end because he has nothing to gain by stopping. From a commander's cold point of view, the second belief produces a more determined army. It removes the exit. It makes every man fight as though his life depends on winning, because he believes it does. So there was a real military logic to teaching soldiers that the Americans were merciless to prisoners. It was not merely hatred, though there was hatred in it. It was a deliberate tool for removing the temptation to surrender, for keeping men fighting when they might otherwise have quit. Picture how it was actually taught, because it was not a poster on a wall. It was a man sitting with his soldiers in the evening in a jungle camp doing political instruction. Locke would gather them and he would talk. He would tell them what the enemy was. He would describe in detail what the Americans did to the men they captured, the torture, the executions, the cruelty, and he had material to work with. He could point to real incidents, real villages, real dead, because that war produced real horrors and the Americans committed their share. He would take those true things and build them into a picture, and the picture was of an enemy who was simply, uniformly, a monster. And the men believed it mostly because it fit. It fit the fear they already felt. It fit the losses they had already suffered. And it fit what they needed to believe in order to keep going. Because a man who has decided the enemy is a monster does not have to wrestle with the harder truth that he is killing other men much like himself. The lie was a comfort as much as a weapon. It made the killing simpler. That is part of why it held so well, and why it was so dangerous when it cracked. And here is the thing that makes this story more than a simple tale of propaganda exposed. The belief worked. It genuinely did contribute to the extraordinary determination of the North Vietnamese soldier. Men who believed capture meant death fought with a desperate ferocity that cost the Americans dearly. So Locke was not being stupid or even purely cynical when he worked to maintain that belief. He was maintaining something that helped his army fight. The trouble was that the belief had a weakness built into it, a single point of failure, and that weakness was the truth, because the picture only worked as long as his soldiers never got a clear look at the real Singh. And in the chaos of that war, sooner or later, some of them did. The thing that kept ruining Locke's careful picture of the merciless enemy was not a weapon or a broadcast or a clever American counter-propaganda campaign. It was a person. It was the American combat medic doing his job. To understand why the medic was such a problem for the lie, you have to understand what the medic actually did, and specifically what he did that the lie could not account for. The American combat medic's entire purpose was to save life under fire. He was trained and driven to run toward wounded men and keep them alive, and this reflex drilled and lived until it was automatic, did not come with a filter that checked whose side the wounded man was on. A medic who spent his war running to save the man screaming in pain did not always stop in the moment to verify the nationality of the scream. And the rules of war which the American military formally followed required exactly this. Under the Geneva Conventions, a wounded enemy who is out of the fight is no longer a combatant. He is a wounded human being entitled to medical care, to be treated according to his need and not his allegiance. American medical personnel were trained in this principle, and a great many of them believed in it. And the result was that wounded North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were very often treated by the same medics, evacuated on the same helicopters, and operated on in the same hospitals as wounded Americans. Watch it happen once in the chaos where it actually happened, and you understand why the lie could not survive it. A firefight ends. The Americans move through the position they have just taken, and among their own wounded, they find enemy wounded, men who, minutes ago, were trying to kill them. A rifleman calls for the medic, and the medic comes and he kneels down next to a wounded North Vietnamese soldier, and he goes to work. He does not do it differently because the man is the enemy. That is the thing. The same hands that would work on an American work on this man, cutting away the clothing, finding the wound, packing it, starting fluids, doing the fast, careful triage that is the medic's whole craft. Around him, other Americans are watching, and some of them do not like it because that man was shooting at them a few minutes ago and may have hit their friends. But the medic works anyway because that is what a medic does. And because the rules say so, and because he cannot easily do otherwise, and the wounded enemy drifting in and out feels hands keeping him alive that belong to the monster he was taught to fear. That moment, repeated across the war, was the thing Locke could never overcome. Think about how completely that contradicted the story Locke was telling. He had taught his men that the Americans executed the wounded, and the reality that some of his men experienced was that the Americans treated the wounded, theirs included, with a level of medical care that was, frankly, often better than what the North Vietnamese could provide for their own. A wounded NVA, or a soldier who fell into American hands, might receive surgery, blood, antibiotics, and care that his own army, for all its devotion, simply did not have the resources to match. The enemy Locke had described as a killer of the helpless was, in the actual experience of some of the helpless, their rescuer. This was not universal, and it is important to be honest about that, because this story is not a fairy tale. War is brutal, and that war was very brutal, and there were real atrocities committed by American forces, and there were wounded enemy who were not treated and killed in violation of every rule. The picture Locke painted was not conjured from nothing. It had real instances behind it, but it was a generalization of the worst into the whole, and the reason it was vulnerable is that the everyday reality for many captured and wounded enemy was the opposite of the picture. The medic, doing his ordinary job, was living proof that the enemy was not the uniform monster the lessons described, and every wounded man the medic saved was a potential witness against the story. That was the crack in Locke's picture, and it was a crack he could do nothing about, because he could not stop the American medics from being what they were. Think about how helpless that made him, tactically. Locke could counter almost anything the Americans did. If they bombed, he dug deeper. If they swept an area, he moved. If they broadcast propaganda from loudspeakers, he could jam it or mock it or simply order his men not to listen. Every American weapon had a counter, because every American weapon was aimed at him, and a thing aimed at you can be dodged or answered. But the medic was not aimed at him. That was the whole problem. The medic was not trying to affect Locke's soldiers at all. He was just saving lives, and the effect on Locke's soldiers' beliefs was a byproduct he never intended and Locke could not intercept. You cannot jam a thing that is not being broadcast. You cannot dodge a thing that is not aimed at you. The medic's kindness reached Locke's men through a channel he did not control and could not close. The direct, private experience of a wounded man being saved. All Locke could do was wait for the survivors to come home and then try to talk them out of what they already knew. He was always reacting, always too late, always trying to unring a bell that had already rung inside another man's memory. He could not prevent them from treating his wounded, because that happened out in the chaos of combat and captivity, far beyond his control. All he could do was manage what happened afterward, when the survivors came back with their impossible stories. He could not stop the truth from happening. He could only try to explain it away, and the explanation he reached for, the only one available to him, was that the kindness was a trick. When a soldier came back from captivity with the story of American mercy, Locke had, in truth, only a few possible responses, and it is worth walking through them because the one he chose tells you everything about the bind he was in. He could not simply deny it happened. The soldier was standing right there, alive, with a healed wound and a healed leg, telling the story to men who could see him. Denial was not available. The evidence was breathing in front of them. Whatever Locke said, he had to say it in a way that accommodated the undeniable fact that this man had been captured and treated and returned and not tortured. He could not admit it was simply true either that the Americans had been kind, full stop, because that would demolish the belief his army depended on. If the men accepted that capture might mean humane treatment, then surrender became thinkable, and the whole desperate determination that made the North Vietnamese soldier so formidable would begin to soften. The truth, plainly admitted, was a threat to the war effort. Locke could not afford it, so he was left with the only move that could accommodate the fact while neutralizing its meaning. Accept that the kindness happened and reframe what it meant. Yes, the American treated you well, but do not be deceived about why. He was not being good. He was being clever. The kindness is a weapon aimed at your mind. It is designed to make you doubt, to make you soft, to make you hesitate. The Americans treat a few prisoners well, precisely so that stories like yours will spread and undermine our resolve. Your survival is not evidence of their goodness. It is evidence of their cunning. Fall for it, and you are doing exactly what they want. You have to appreciate how well constructed that reframe is as a piece of psychological defense because it is genuinely clever. It does not fight the evidence. It absorbs it. It takes the very fact that threatens the belief and turns it into further proof of the belief. The enemy is devious, and look, here is his deviousness, disguised as kindness. Every act of mercy becomes another layer of the enemy's cunning. The story is now unfalsifiable. Kind treatment does not disprove that the Americans are the enemy. It proves how sophisticated an enemy they are. There is no piece of evidence a returning prisoner could bring that this frame cannot swallow. Hear how it would have sounded spoken by a skilled man to soldiers who wanted to be reassured. Of course they treated you well, he says. Do you understand why? Because they are clever. They know that if they torture every prisoner, we will fight harder. So instead, they treat a few of you kindly and send you back so that you will tell exactly the story you are telling now. You are the weapon, comrade. You did not escape their trap. You are carrying it right now into this camp, into these men. The kindness was never for you. It was for us to weaken us through you. And by repeating it, you are doing their work for them. It is a devastating little speech if you follow its logic, because it turns the grateful survivor into an unwitting traitor and shames him into silence. And it reframes the men's own doubt as exactly what the enemy wants them to feel, so that the very act of wondering becomes proof that the enemy is manipulating you. That is how you defend a belief against a fact. You make the fact into evidence, and you make the doubt into betrayal. Locke was good at it, but being good at it was not the same as it being true, and the men who had felt the medic's hands could tell the difference, however clever the speech. And this kind of reframe is not unique to that war or that army. It is one of the oldest tools in the maintenance of any belief system under pressure. When reality contradicts a belief that people need to hold, the belief does not simply collapse. It grows a defense, and the most durable defense is the one that reinterprets the contradicting evidence as confirmation. The kindness was a trick. The mercy was a manipulation. It is a way of keeping a belief alive in the face of the very facts that should kill it, and Locke reached for it because it was the only thing that could hold his soldiers' picture of the enemy together. It was, in a sense, the sophisticated move, but it had a cost, and the cost was that some of his men could feel the strain of it and did not quite believe. The trouble with telling a man that the person who saved his life was only pretending to care is that the man was there, and you were not. And this is where Locke's clever reframe met its limit, in the memory of the soldier who had actually been carried out of the fire. Put yourself in that soldier's place. You are lying in the mud, wounded, certain you are about to die. And everything you have ever been told says that if the Americans reach you first, they will finish you. And then an American does reach you, and he does not finish you. He kneels over you, this enemy, this monster from the lessons, and his hands are gentle and fast and sure, and he is doing everything he can to keep you alive. He talks to you maybe in a language you do not understand, but the tone is unmistakable. The tone a person uses to reassure someone who is frightened and hurt. He gets you out. Later, you wake in a hospital, and you are alive, and no one has hurt you. Now your officer tells you it was a trick. And here's the thing. Some part of you may want to believe him because it is easier, because it lets you keep the world the way it was, because doubting is frightening. But another part of you was there, and that part knows something the officer's words cannot reach. Because you did not just receive medical care. You looked into the face of the man saving you. You saw his A's. And a wounded person can tell at a level far below argument the difference between a man performing a calculated deception and a man who simply cannot stand to watch another human being die in front of him. You saw which one it was. You cannot prove it, but you know it. That is the thing Locke's reframe could not defeat, not in the men who had actually experienced the kindness. It could work on the men who had only heard the story secondhand, because for them, the kindness was just a report, and a report can be reinterpreted. But for the man who had lived it, the reframe asked him to disbelieve his own direct experience of another human being, and that is very hard to do, because the human capacity to read sincerity in another person's face is deep and old and largely resistant to being argued out of. The soldier had seen the medic's face. No political lesson could unshow him what he had seen. So these men lived with a private crack in the official picture. Most of them, sensibly, kept quiet about it because saying it out loud was dangerous, but it stayed with them. Picture the soldier the night he came back before Locke got to him, sitting with the men he had fought beside, telling them what had happened. He is not trying to make trouble. He is just telling the truth because it is the most extraordinary thing that has ever happened to him, and he cannot hold it in. And the men lean in because they have all wondered in the private place where you are not supposed to wonder, what really happens if the Americans take you? And here is a man who knows, who went and came back, and he tells them. The hands in the mud, the helicopter, the hospital, the surgeon, the fact, the impossible fact that no one hurt him. And you can watch it land on their faces, one by one. Some of them refuse it outright because it is too destabilizing and they need the monster to stay a monster. But some of them go quiet in a different way, a thoughtful way, because a door has just opened that they had been told was a wall. That quiet is exactly what Locke feared, and it is why he had to act. It was not the story itself that was dangerous. It was the thinking it started. And it produced a strange and quiet thing across that war. A population of soldiers who had been taught to hate an enemy, and who mostly still fought that enemy, but who carried inside them a single piece of counter-evidence that they could not explain away, because they had felt it with their own bodies. They knew something the lessons denied. They knew that at least one of the enemy, in at least one moment, had been not a monster, but a man who had chosen, at some risk to himself, to save a stranger who had been trying to kill him. To understand the full weight of what Locke was up against, you have to understand the thing at the very center of this story, which is the question the whole thing turns on: why did the American medic do it? Why treat the enemy at all? And the answer is, what made the kindness so impossible to explain away? Because the answer was not, in fact, a trick. Start with the simplest part of the answer, which is duty. American military doctrine and the laws of war required the treatment of wounded enemy prisoners, and the medics were trained to follow those rules. So at one level, the medic treated the enemy because that was the rule, and he was a disciplined professional. But anyone who has looked at how this actually happened knows that duty alone does not explain it, because men under fire do not risk their lives for a rule they do not feel. There was something underneath the duty. That something was the nature of the medic himself. The men who became good combat medics were very often men with an unusually strong and unswitch-off able impulse to relieve suffering. It was why they were good at the job, and that impulse, once it was running, did not check identity. A medic who had spent months conditioning himself to run toward anyone who was hurt found, when he came upon a wounded enemy, that the same reflex fired. Here was a human being, torn open, frightened, dying. The medic's entire being was organized around one response to that sight, and the response did not pause to ask which army the dying man belonged to. Many medics describe this directly, that in the moment, the wounded enemy stopped being an enemy and became simply a patient, a body that needed what they knew how to give. Listen to the way medics actually talked about it afterward, because it is nothing like a strategy. They did not say, "I treated the enemy to win his mind." They said things like, "He was just a kid." They said, "He was hurt, and I was the medic, so I worked on him." They described looking at a wounded North Vietnamese soldier and seeing not the enemy, but someone's son, frightened and torn open and a long way from home, which is exactly what the wounded American beside him was too. The two of them, in that moment, were the same thing. A body that might live if the medic was fast enough, and the medic could not, in his bones, sort them by which flag they had been carrying. The suffering was identical, and his response to suffering was the same reflex either way. Some of them were troubled by it, and honest about that too. It is a strange thing to spend 1 hour trying to kill men and the next hour trying to save one of them. But most of them, pressed on it, came back to the same simple ground. That is the job. You do not let a man die in front of you because of the uniform he was wearing an hour ago. And there was something in that refusal that steadied them, a line they would not cross even in a war that was asking them to cross every other line. Treating the enemy wounded was, for a lot of medics, the thing that let them still recognize themselves. And there was something even deeper in it, which some of the men articulated and others only felt. To treat the enemy wounded was, for the medic, a way of holding on to his own humanity in the middle of a war that was constantly trying to strip it away. War asks men to kill, and killing does something to a person. The medic, uniquely, was the man whose job was the opposite of killing, and treating the wounded, all the wounded, even the enemies, was a way of remaining. In the midst of all that death, a person who saved rather than destroyed. It was not a trick played on the enemy. If anything, it was a gift the medic gave himself, proof in a place with very little of it that he was still a healer and not only a soldier. Now you can see why Locke's reframe was doomed with the men who had experienced it, because the reframe said, "This kindness is a calculated deception aimed at your mind." And the truth was almost the opposite. This kindness was the least calculated thing in the entire war. It was a reflex, an instinct, a man's deepest nature overriding the fact that he was supposed to hate the person in front of him. There was nothing strategic in it. It was the single most spontaneous, undesigned, human thing a person could do in that place, and the wounded soldier who had been on the receiving end of it could feel that. He could feel that whatever this was, it was not a plan. You cannot fake the thing the medic was showing him, and some deep part of him knew you couldn't, and that is why the lie could not hold. Locke survived the war and lived into old age, and like many men who spend their youth maintaining a belief, he spent his later years quietly examining it. And the thing he kept returning to was the impossible position the American medic had put him in. He did not, looking back, regret the propaganda, exactly or not simply. He understood why he had done it. He had been trying to keep his soldiers alive and fighting in a desperate war against a materially superior enemy, and the belief that capture meant death had genuinely helped them do that. He had not been lying for the pleasure of it. He had been reaching for a tool that worked in service of a cause he believed in. On his own terms, he had done his job, and he had watched that job be undermined again and again, not by any enemy, weapon, but by the enemy's wounded saving. What he came to understand, and to say with a certain rueful honesty, was that the trick explanation had been a defense he did not entirely believe himself. He had needed it to be a trick, because the alternative was too destabilizing. But somewhere in him, he had known that the American medics were not executing a psychological operation. He had questioned enough returning prisoners and looked into enough of their faces as they described what had happened to them to understand that they had encountered something real. He had told them it was a trick, because that was what the war required him to say. He was not sure in his own heart that it was true. And he came to think that this was the deepest kind of problem for an army built, as his was, on ideological certainty. An army that runs on belief is powerful, because belief can make men do extraordinary things. But it is also brittle in a specific way. It cannot easily survive contact with the truth that contradicts it. The North Vietnamese soldiers' willingness to sacrifice was built, in part, on a picture of the enemy as a monster. And that picture had a fatal vulnerability, which was that the enemy was not entirely a monster, and any soldier who encountered the enemy's better nature directly received a piece of evidence that no amount of political instruction could fully erase. The Americans, without particularly trying to, had a counter-propaganda weapon of enormous power, and it was simply the ordinary decency of their medical corps, which no lie could permanently explain away. He noticed, too, the thing that this whole story finally comes down to. The medics were not trying to win the propaganda war. That was the beautiful and maddening part. If they had been running a deliberate campaign of strategic kindness, Locke could have fought it. You can fight a strategy, expose it, counter it. But they were not running a campaign. They were just being who they were, young men whose job was to save life, saving the life in front of them, without calculating its citizenship. And there is no defense against that, because there is nothing to expose. The kindness was real, and its realness was its power. And the only thing Locke could ever do about it was to tell his men it was fake, and hope they did not look too closely at the faces of the men who had saved them. And he came to see, late, that the war had quietly produced two kinds of men on his own side because of this. There were the ones who had only ever heard the lessons, who had never met the enemy except through a rifle sight, and for them the monster stayed a monster, clean and simple, all the way to the end. And there were the others, the ones who had been captured, or wounded and saved, or who had simply been close enough to see an American medic kneel by a dying Vietnamese and work to save him. Those men carried something the first group did not disloyalty. Most of them fought on, hard, to the end of the war. But they fought carrying a complication, a small, stubborn fact that would not dissolve, that made the enemy harder to hate cleanly. Locke understood that he had spent his war trying to keep his men in the first group and out of the second, and he understood that he had been fighting a losing battle because the thing that moved men from one group to the other was not propaganda he could counter. It was direct experience of the enemy's humanity, and there was no way to inoculate a man against that except to make sure he never encountered it, and in a war that long and that chaotic, you could not. Here is what the whole strange story of the medic and the lie finally comes down to, and it is a lesson that reaches far beyond one war. Every army that has ever fought has told its soldiers a story about the enemy because it is easier to kill a monster than a man, and armies need their soldiers to be able to kill. The North Vietnamese told their soldiers that the Americans were merciless, that capture meant torture and death, and they told it for a real reason. Because a soldier who believes surrender is death will fight to the end, and that made their army harder to beat. It was a lie, but it was a lie with a purpose, built on selected truths, and it worked. Right up until the moment it met the one thing it could not survive. And the thing it could not survive was not a bigger lie, or a cleverer argument, or a propaganda campaign of the Americans' own. It was simply the truth, delivered in the most personal way imaginable, an American medic kneeling in the mud, saving the life of the very enemy he was supposed to be a monster to. The lie could survive almost anything except a soldier's direct, physical, face-to-face experience of the enemy's humanity. Against that, the officer had only one move left, and it was a desperate one: to tell his men that the kindness was a trick. And the move was clever, and it worked on the men who had only heard the story. But it could never fully work on the men who had lived it, because you cannot argue a man out of what he saw in the face of the person who saved his life. That is why "it's a trick" was the only thing Locke could say, and also why it was never quite enough. It was the last defense of a belief that had run into a fact it could not absorb. He needed his soldiers to see a monster, and one of them had been carried out of the fire, gently in the monster's arms, and had seen up close that it was not a monster at all. No lesson could unshow him that. The officer could reframe it and reinterpret it and warn against it, but he could not delete it because it lived in the soldier's own body, in the memory of a stranger's hands keeping him alive. The deepest irony of all is the one Locke understood at the end. The medic's kindness was the one thing in that war that could not be countered as propaganda, precisely because it was not propaganda. It was not aimed at anyone's mind. It was just a man doing the thing his own nature demanded, saving the life in front of him, and its power over the enemy's beliefs was an accident, a side effect of simple decency. You cannot defend against sincerity. You can only call it fake and hope no one looks too hard. And notice which direction this cuts, because it matters and it keeps the story honest. This is not really a story about one side being good and the other being liars. Every army in that war told its soldiers stories about the enemy, the Americans included, and every army had its atrocities and its comfortable simplifications. The lesson here is not about who was virtuous. It is about the strange, specific power of a genuine act of humanity in the middle of organized hatred. How a single sincere kindness can slip past every defense a belief system builds, precisely because it was never a strategy. Propaganda can be answered with propaganda, a real thing done for real reasons in front of a man's own eyes cannot. That is true no matter whose uniform the medic wears. They told their men the medics were a trick because the alternative was unbearable. Because if the medics were sincere, then the enemy was human, and a human enemy is a much harder thing to fight than a monster. So they called mercy a manipulation, and kindness a weapon, and they made the enemy's decency into just another proof of the enemy's cunning. It held for the men who only heard about it. It never held for the men who felt it. Because in the end, the one thing you cannot convince a man is a lie is the moment a stranger chose to save his life. Now you know why. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. These are the histories worth keeping, not just the famous battles with their famous names, but the quiet, complicated truths about the men on every side, and the moments of humanity that no propaganda could quite erase. If it meant something to you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these videos find the people who care about them. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a new one. I would love to know where you are watching from today, and if someone in your family served in Vietnam, a medic, a corpsman, a soldier on any side who was treated by one, anyone in any unit, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the one you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.